Hey Thornton. So for our group project, we went over game design, and my specific part was on prototyping. So in my paper, I specifically talked about whenever you're doing prototyping, where do you want to start, and then whenever what am I making it in, and then I go over prototyping in general software development. So I tried to go over just like where to start. That kind of deems over into analysis, but I'll and like design, but I'll go over to that later. And then I tried to talk about doing it personally versus in a company of game design specifically. Uh, and then I just talked about the need for testing and how prototyping comes into that. So for where do you want to start in game design? That I was typically talking about that whenever you're starting, you want to choose what system you're working on, whether that is on your computer, whether you want to make a computer game, or whether you're making something for Xbox, phone, for an Apple in particular, because all of those require different languages to start in. Because every time, whenever we're prototyping, depending on what you're gonna work in, you're gonna pick something different. And depending on like if you're working in a group, some more people might like Unreal, uh, and some people might be more comfortable with like making stuff on a phone, which you might want to do like Unity stuff for smaller games that aren't as complex, especially for in like environments. Um, that also leads into the what am I making it in, which I go over whenever you're making game design, you're gonna want to choose where you're making it in and like where you're wanting to start because you can't really start prototyping until you figure out what you want to start prototyping in. So for like whenever we went to go do a game jam over in January, we had to decide whether we wanted to start in Unreal or Unity to start making our prototyping in. So whenever we first started, we had two of us start working on like Unreal stuff, where we start just testing out their blueprints and what we want to do there, and then we just tested out on Unity what we thought we could possibly do in 48 hours. We eventually chose Unity because Unity was just what we were all more comfortable in. Not as many of us were comfortable in creating games in Unreal. Uh, and in game design, this is one of the most important things whenever you're prototyping is you have to figure out which system is better for your prototyping in, whether it's making a RPG or making an FPS or making just a little phone game that's for idle to make money. Um, and all of that matters is whenever making a prototyping game. Then after that, I go into prototyping in general software development. And what I talked about there is in game design, a lot of it is you're going to be working hands on, trying to make your character walk forward, make them jump up, make them do just like a grapple hook, or just you're testing some certain system and you're getting straight in to do that. But in general software development, especially if you're working in a big company, a lot of that comes back to the analysis and pre-planning because you don't want to dive straight into prototyping until you have a full setup area to start working in. Because generally, when you're working in game design, especially by yourself, you're just going to be testing out what you think that you can do and what you can accomplish. But in giant software companies, there's certain steps for prototyping where you have to start creating something and you have to think, can I get this done in this amount of allotted time, and do I have the money and resources set up and set aside to complete what I'm thinking about? And a lot of that is just testing of what you think your group can accomplish in that amount of time, and prototyping, especially in there, allows you to think of what you can get done. Because if you don't try and work a little bit and then figure out like I can probably get that done in 6 months, then you might end up just thinking that you can do a lot more. That especially went back to the game jam where initially we had like 3 or 4 just basic ideas of what you think, and then you have to, and then we realized we didn't have enough time to do it in 48 hours because a few of those were very complicated, and us splitting up the job between different departments of the game, uh, it just messes up if you don't prototype early on to see what you can figure out. So specifically going to prototyping personally versus a company is, yeah, talking about that uh, the game design thing. If you're working alone, you have to prototype each specific thing, especially if you're not too good at making music. You have to prototype with different software to figure out that I can work with this very easily because I'm not very like musically adept, and this is very good for beginners to work with. And for stuff, say like for Blender for visuals, you have to mess around with what you think is. Do you want to prototype and work with a 2D game because you're very good at making sprites and other 2D animations, or do you think you can go full fledged and go 3D? And then that also comes back down to, am I doing first person where I can see my hands, or am I working with just like a gun that just tilts whenever I'm moving my mouse? Or am I going full third person where I have to make animations and work with everything because I can't just have a still avatar walking around like that? Um, but working for a company, just same thing goes back to like general software development. A lot of that is set back to pre-planning, and then prototyping is not as much because usually whenever you get hired on for a company, you're hired on for a specific thing and specific stuff you know. So if you get hired for visuals for a company, typically you already know exactly what you're adept in and what you can't do. So your prototyping is usually simpler because you're not having to figure out which software you want to work with because you're either told ahead of time of that or you know what you want to work with. So prototyping then is all about more of the like final product, whether you want it to be based on, I want this to be a dungeon crawler where I'm making monsters and skeletons and stuff like that that fits there, or you want to, or I'm making specifically a, you know that you specifically want to make a climbing game in Unity that has to do in a skyscraper city. So everyone can work on uh, prototyping of like sounds in the city, or you're working on buildings, or you're working on getting that grapple hook set up. Because usually when you're hired for a company, you know exactly what you want to do and what you're trying to do. But whenever you're working personally or with a small group, you can change all those around, and prototyping is a lot bigger because usually it's just based on what you can do as a person and less of what your company can get done. So usually the prototyping is more prevalent in smaller companies, especially the side of just testing stuff, because you especially know what you want to do. If you're prototyping for a big company, it's a lot harder to figure out exactly what you're like wanting to do, because if you want to change something, you have to go up in the chain of demand and ask, "Can I get this done? When is our like release date, and what are we trying to get this done by?" Especially if you're working in a big company like Activision that has a bunch of smaller like child companies underneath it, where you're given a command where you have to, they want an FPS game and they want it in 3 or 4 years, and then you're like, how big of a game do we think we can make in this? Because in 3 or 4 years you can make a gigantic game, but if you get halfway through that and then you didn't think ahead enough, and then the parent company's like, this is not a good game, you can't make this, you're gonna get canceled, or you're gonna have to restart and waste, and you just wasted a ton of time that could have been making something that if you had just worked out and pre-planned and prototyped early on to get exactly what you want, you could have taken out some of that time that you might have put to waste. Um, and then that also just leans into the testing aspect of that. I mean, the best way to ensure that you're going to get a game time is implement and prototype exactly what you want to do, because that goes back all the way to the design phase, because each phase from the beginning needs to be bigger to make sure that the other phases ahead of it be smaller to speed up the time. So the more time you spend in analysis and design, the less time you have to spend in prototyping and the less time you have to spend in making and stuff like that. Because if you can narrow down exactly what you're trying to do as a developer, you can just make it a lot easier and cost your company a lot less money if you have to restart, or cost them a lot less time and resources if you can just figure out exactly what you want to do and prototype. Because if you're doing a prototyping and you're specifically as a developer, like for a single, you don't think you could get portals done in a reasonable amount of time and make them look good and work well without being very glitchy, then you might have to completely flip up what you're wanting to make for a game. Because as developers, we tend to overthink what we're wanting to make and get straight into, I really want to make this type of game and it sounds like it'll be super fun, but you don't think of the technicalities of what like that kind of game bring and what kind of issues you'll probably have if you start just diving around away. You have to take it systematically to make sure that you don't waste a lot of time, especially if you're getting paid to do something. Which that leans into every part of software development if we do, which you just have to think ahead on these projects. There is no you dive right in and you get to working, because the second that you stumble upon an issue later on, you're gonna have to go back and back and back and fix every issue, which is how it connected to our work in software engineering too, where we have to talk about all our charts and how we talked about the EEG readings of a headset, where every time we found an issue further down, we had to go back and back and back and fix our charts near the beginning and second steps, where we have to make different tables. Um, but prototyping is a great way to figure out where you think you might mess up and to really realize your capabilities, because if you just can't dive in and figure out and try and figure out, then you have to figure out what you can work with and prototype each separate step. Because if you're in a game, you have to prototype what kind of movement you have to have. What kind of shooting am I having? Am I having like a Counter-Strike type of shooting, to where you have as a character and as a player, you have to stand still. And do you think that is that more beneficial for your game type, or do you want like a looter shooter runner like Borderlands or say like Doom, where you typically don't stop moving at all and you just shoot? So do you it all of that just contributes to slower pace, faster paced, whether you're making like a giant game like Skyrim, like open world, or making a smaller game like Mario Kart. Every little thing has to be prototyped to figure out what you can get done, and ultimately everything you prototype will have an effect on your final game. Every small decision of movement and just everything will will affect your end product. And so prototyping really like depends on what you do and how much you can get done. And in the long run, it's one of the most important steps because it's what gets you set up for the rest of the time. Thank you, Thornton.